Hello all. I had the opportunity to sit down for an interview with Dr. Jacque Micieli-Voutsinas, author of Affective Heritage and the Politics of Memory After 9/11 and Affective Architectures. We talked about the partition of India and 9/11 and the connections that might be made between these two traumatic geopolitical events and the trilateral relations between India, Pakistan, and America.
Interesting. How have you been thinking about this work in relationship to recent anniversaries? So I'm thinking in terms of August, and also we have an anniversary coming up here in the US. So how are you thinking about those anniversaries as these function as two separate geopolitical events, but also events that have legacies that seem to intersect and intertwine?
Oh, yeah. So obviously, the August anniversary is the 76th anniversary now of the partition of India, which created Pakistan in the first place, right? And 9/11, is going to be the 22nd anniversary, right? This 9/11 is going to be the 22nd anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attack. These days, I kind of think about questions of if this had not happened, would that have happened? That sort of thing. So I was thinking the other day, if 9/11 had not happened, let's say, in an alternate parallel universe, would Trump have become president? And I would posit that the answer is no. Because 9/11 polarized US like nothing else, and really revealed this sort of xenophobia that not only was it hidden, but I think had subsided, was, I think, healing. Since the first Gulf War. And then 9/11 happened and everybody was like, oh, forget it, all bets are off, these people are terrorists, these Muslims, all of this stuff.
It certainly created an opening for revitalizing fear of the other, xenophobia, Islamophobia, phobia, right? Fear in general.
Yeah, and that is Trump's platform. That's his platform. So same way, I wonder if the partition had not happened.
I was going to ask that.
If 1947 was just, resulted in a unified India. No partition, no Pakistan. Would 9/11 have happened?
I know. Interesting to put those together too, because I wonder how many people think about, right? Like the Afghan-Pakistan border region, right? And what that means in terms of Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen, and this, what would that have meant?
The training, right? The training camps. Even I would almost even go so far as to say Afghanistan would have been a different country because Pakistan was there, the proxy war could take place in between Russia and the US because Pakistan was the proxy for the US in that war. If that hadn't been there, the Cold War even could have been different. And I wonder if there had been no Pakistan, it was just a unified India, could 9/11 have happened? Could it have built up to the extent could al-Qaeda and all these other groups have got so much training and so much armaments, resources?
Such an interesting question too, because I mean, like those things are very tangible, right? Like the training, the armament, this kind of interstitial space that's like it's not necessarily these very clearly defined national borders, and then there's also tribal affiliations and law, so it becomes this kind of like extra legal zone in some way for certain kinds of activity to happen, and also from the US's perspective as well. I mean, that's how the training happened there in the first place. Federally, tribally administered area. And something that seems so absolutely disconnected from US historiography and US history.
Yes.
This event that happened, there's zero, well, not zero, but the relationship between the US and India, it's not like a British, Indian, historiography or relationship of colonial, neo-colonial, and then the US emerges after World War II as kind of like this emerging empire and emerging imperial power, like this thing that seems so disconnected from this other anniversary and this other memory event. Like how much that question is so interesting. Like, would that have even happened had this not happened? And I think we could sit and ponder that for a little bit too, but it just makes me think about how like these deeply traumatic that's like 76 years ago, 75 years ago, almost a century ago, has such reverberations that are so central to something that happened very recently, and also the ramifications of that event, 9/11, right? Being like, how do we understand things like Trumpism, the deep polarization in the US, the racial tension, all of the things, and then like how do we understand these things? Like, I know you and I can go on that, but I want to hear your thoughts on that. And then like, what does that mean? Is that like why putting these things in a room means something to you as an artist? Like to try to draw that out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's a great question. Putting these two neons, right? This neon, the India-Pakistan border neon, and this, the Bangladesh neon, because these were the two lines that were created, right, in 1947, and then, the East Pakistan became Bangladesh in 1971. But initially, I was resisting putting them here. The curator and I were kind of going back and forth, and then I was like, let me just think about this. And then as I was thinking through it, and I was like, it's just stepping way back. That's when this question came to me: is that if partition had never happened, if there was no Pakistan, would 9/11 have necessarily happened? And then I was like, okay, it makes sense, because there are a lot of underground connections, I would say. They are not easily visible. They're not easily, they're not easy connections to make.
And it's like a mining of memory, like to get there, because I also want to like clarify too, that the hijackers, right, are not Pakistani ethnicity, right, or nationals. They're Saudi for the most part. 15 out of the 19 hijackers are Saudi. And I can't even remember if there is even one Pakistani hijacker off the top of my head. Point to say that is that, it was like a non-obvious, like, on some regard after 9/11 to be like Afghanistan, right? Like, why are we going to Afghanistan, right? Like Pakistan is also an ally, right? Like, and we have this allied relationship with Afghanistan, like from the Cold War era and our proxy war with the Russians, right, for influence. But why there, right? We didn't do anything in Saudi Arabia. It was also an ally. We didn't like extradite specific people, but we had this war on terror. And the geographies of that became Afghanistan, and then subsequently later Iraq, and then it became more globalized as people were, targeted outside of boundaries. Right? Let's talk about boundaries and borders. Like this,
Yeah.
but so in any case, I just want to like pause for a second and maybe, I don't know if you want to like give some sense of like what are like, can you pull out one of those underground threads? Like, why are we even asking that question? If the Indian partition didn't happen, would 9/11 been able to happen? Maybe could you pull some of those threads out for people so they could see that?
Absolutely. So it's been a few years, but Osama bin Laden was holed up in Pakistan. I mean, that says a lot. That was safe haven for him, quote unquote, ally country, right? And he was not that far from Islamabad, the capital, where US embassies are and consulates are and all this stuff. I would say so when he was found there, right, there was surprise and sort of consternation in India that, oh my God, if Osama bin Laden can hide from the US in Pakistan, right under the noses of the US consulate. So there's some real fear about Pakistan's complex politics. The army sort of has its own agenda. The democratic process is precarious at best. No democratic government has been allowed to finish its term. Really saying something. The dictatorships that have flourished have had a lot of resources from the US. So, I mean, that's a connection right there. That's right there. And not to, sound very critical or taking sides or anything like that. I'm very sympathetic to the Pakistani cause as well. The desire to have your own homeland where you can feel like, okay, this is my home country. I will not be marginalized, where I will not be discriminated against, where I can practice my religion freely. I mean, those are justifiable reasons to seek a country of your own. However, what happened after that in all these subsequent decades is what creates those threads. It creates those threads to terrorism, to the Cold War, to neocolonialism, which the US engages in a lot of countries, especially in the Middle East. So those threads are important to reveal and talk about, because I think they get buried, under all the latest news headlines. The Iraq War left a mess. That's why this work, right? The war, the global war on terror. The Brown University, there's a task group in Brown University was just saying, about it. They're saying it's 4.5 million official, right? 4.5 million now. That's the official count of casualties between Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Pakistan, Afghanistan. So again, 3,000 American lives, 4.5 million Muslim lives. So the persecution, if you want to call it that, or discrimination or stereotyping, if you want to keep it benign, is real. But so is the terrorism, and I feel like there is a symbiotic relationship between neocolonialism, especially America's, and the rise of terrorism. Because a lot of these groups that have now become terrorists are basically political groups that were armed and resourced by the West and are now out of favor, because now they're asking for more than what was promised, or whatever other political reasons there might be.
The legacies of European colonialism, neocolonialism, Western imperialism, right, is absolutely the seeds in many cases of armed violence, right? And what starts as like a anti-colonial resistance movement, right? And like who and how that is mobilized and utilized for different geopolitical puzzle games, right? Like there's so much happening here in reconstructing and reshaping spheres of influence and national borders and national identities. And that's there's this really great read that talks about like Afghanistan, right, as like this geography that like breaks all empires. And like they're talking, they're like foreshadowing in some way, like, is it going to break the US also? Because the way in which borders were drawn, right, it completely disregards ethnic and communal ties that have existed in the region for thousands of years, right? And so like part of that AFPAC border that we were starting this conversation with are based on those communal ethnic ties that transcend national borders, right? And so you have this very complex new nation state project rooted in these histories of colonialism, neocolonialism, imperialism, and then these wars, proxy wars, sphere of influence wars, the Cold War, right? Like all of these ways in which it deepens. It's like trauma begets trauma, and trauma compounds on trauma. Like there's so much happening there in this region, and it also then becomes this, if you will, a ground zero for the war on terror, right? Like it becomes like this primary place of US intervention in a military way. But it goes back to this very, again, interesting conversation of like, how are these things even related? Like, how is something that happened halfway across the world that had nothing to do with American, relations, and like it was British colonialism, and like, how did this thing happen where now it's like so centered or central to understanding US history today, understanding 9/11, the post 9/11 moment. And I guess as a question, like, how do you see, like, again, we have these anniversaries, as I started off with, where's it going? Well, like, how do you see, right, like what's happening now? I mean, I don't want to demonize, like we tried to unpack demonizing Pakistan, right, and the way in which, as it framed as a Muslim nation, right, it becomes the clear other in a war on terror, and also the way in which the history between India and Pakistan also heightens that rift, right, between ethno-religious divide. So how do we understand all this? Like, where's it leading now? Like, what's going on? How do we follow the thread today?
I think the more we can sort of broaden our own scope of, knowledge, news we follow, books we read, friends we make, to include people from these far off lands, because a lot of them are migrating to the US, have been migrating to the US, and bring them to the table for discourse and conversation. I think just that work will reveal more threads, even more threads than what we talked about today,
I'm looking at you saying this, and I'm listening to you say with this word behind you. Anamnesis, right? Which is like this interesting word that's the first time I think I've said it aloud, anamnesis. I don't even know if I'm saying it right, but what I'm hearing you like describe in some way is a remembering, right? Like a series of acts of remembering, right? Like your intentionality of putting these sites, which you're like, what do all these sites have to do with each other? And you're reassembling, right? Like these geographies in these rooms together in these very particular kinds of ways. And then like looking at like, what is the metaphor between them all? Like, how are they interrelated? How are they connected? How do we understand these acts of remembrance where there are different there are different versions, if you will, of memory out there, right? And if we don't understand them all, right, we're actually like, we're isolated from understanding ourselves more fully, right? And I guess I'm wondering, could you speak to that name behind you and think about like, what are you hoping that'll do, these acts of remembrance? Like, what can we learn from that? What can we gain from that?
Well, I mean, that is the basic hope, is that we engage in the act of analysis. We engage in the act of putting pieces together that are lost from our collective memories, you know, of these historical events, of these geopolitical events. So A, engage in that. B, create these transnational bridges that enable those threads, more of those threads to be revealed, so that we may understand our own country better and our own policies better, and, you know, lead us to more sort of causal thinking. Like, what is the cause of 9/11? It did not just drop out of the air that day. And, you know, what enabled it? What are the enablers of this kind of a terrorist attack? So I hope that that's where this work goes. Is, even though it seems absurd to connect the partition of 1947, the partition of India in 1947, to 9/11 in 2001. I mean, let's entertain that absurdity for a minute and see if some viable connections can be made.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Thank you for
Absolutely.